Hi. If you're either a novice teacher or even an experienced teacher, you probably prepare your lessons. I know I do, even though I've been teaching for well over 30 years. And my way of preparing a lesson is probably different from yours. Jack Richards, in his book on language teaching methodology, gives this quote: "All outstanding teachers are ideal in their own ways, and as such are different from each other." So let me move on now to my own lesson plan for today's talk. And so I'll give you an overview of what I'm going to be doing, and I will share my approach to lesson planning for a 3-hour course that I give at the college level. First, I'll talk about why do lesson planning, why it's so important. And second, I'll look at look at structuring a lesson using the classic ESA model, E standing for engage, S for study, and A for activate. And then I'll share some ideas on pacing a lesson. Finally, I'll talk about the ways of closing a lesson. Hi, my name is Frank Bunkowski. I'm a college English language teacher at Cégep Saint Laurent in Montreal, and I'm also author of a college textbook called Actively Engage in Academic Writing, published by Bokomaru Publications, and the book is geared to intermediate and advanced English language learners. So let me move on now to the next phase here, if I can call up my next presentation here. Why do lesson planning? And as I mentioned, even though I've been teaching for well over 30 years, closer to 40 years in fact, still going, I still believe that lesson planning is an essential tool for having a successful lesson, or at least giving me a chance, an opportunity to have a successful lesson. Again, Richards, the famous master of language teaching methodology, presents 6 reasons why lesson planning is key, is so important. First, it provides a roadmap for the lesson. It gives a sense of security of where I particularly love to take learners in the lesson. Secondly, it helps think through and rehearse the lesson. In other words, I get to visualize the content, the activities, and the evaluation. And it gives a real sense of security, and it helps me feel confident in speaking in front of a group of 25 young adults keen on learning, in offering value to the students and maximizing their learning opportunities. Next, it clearly lays out the sequence and timing of activities. So important. Sequence and timing. And it's so important for both me and the students to stay on task and not waste time. I might add, it gives an opportunity as a first option, which I can adjust or modify according to the flow of a lesson. And it also puts into practice, on a daily lesson basis, my beliefs about teaching. For example, putting learners at the center of the lesson. What's in it for me, as so far? Integrating the language skills through project work. Ensuring relevance to student interests and needs, and encouraging social interaction through pair or group work. And it also, finally, reminds me about the being passionate and enthusiastic about a teacher. Finally, it provides a record of what's been done, both by me and the students, during the lesson. It builds continuity from lesson to lesson. Frankly, I'd be lost if I didn't have that record. So let me move on now to a comment from an experienced teacher, a colleague of mine at Cégep de Saint Laurent, Ursula Mueller, who comments here, she always prepares very detailed lesson plans. She aims for each lesson to build student self-esteem, have students connect with each other, and use new forms of expressions. For Ursula, a lesson plan should be detailed and structured, but flexible, allowing for improvisation. And let me also go on to comment a comment from another colleague of mine, Becky McKnight of Cégep Saint-Jean, who, on her beliefs, she believes that you need clear objectives and purposeful objectives. And students have to be aware of them. Let students know you care and enjoy the assignment. Enjoy the assignments you give. So important. You got to have fun, put some humor into it, and finally, you have to establish your classroom culture early, especially regarding mutual self-interest. So let me move on now to the next stage of the ESA model, which is, well, to go to the ESA model, how to structure a lesson using the ESA model. So let me paint a broad picture of this model, and I'll answer these questions. How can a teacher help students learn successfully using the model? Engage, study, activate. What can teachers do to engage learners? What are some effective study activities? And how can teachers have students activate their learning? The ASA model, which involves both teacher and learners, is based on the ideas of another iconic figure in language teaching methodology, Jeremy Harmer, from his influential book, How to Teach English. And in a nutshell, this teaching learning model is based on these three essential principles. Learners need to be motivated, exposed to meaningful language, and provided chances to use the language. So here under Engage, we in the language classroom, students to learn, it makes good pedagogical sense to engage them. You need to arouse students' interest, thus involving their emotions, according to Harmer. And even, of course, in my experience, even before you get students interested, you first have to catch their attention. When I started second language teaching in high school many, many moons ago, I was lucky to have a brilliant pedagogue as a school principal, Aurel Daou, rest in peace. He would often remind teachers about the importance of being enthusiastic and engaging oneself in the subject matter. You can't expect learners to be interested if you're not passionate about what you're doing. And I've never forgotten that sound advice. And you'll see in the next slide here, actually, if I go on to that, Bloom's taxonomy, the affective domain. The very first level, as you can see there, is receiving phenomena. Learners need to be aware, show willingness to hear, and be attentive. They got to get off their cell phones. In my very first meeting with the new second language learners at the beginning of a new term at the college, I always demonstrate and practice receiving. How so? Well, first I tell learners my name. Then I mention something interesting, I think, about myself, such as how I like to do triathlons. As a mature athlete, self-proclaimed mature athlete, a combination of swimming, running, and biking, and this always catches their attention, even if they're not particularly interested in sports. And then I ask those students to say their name and something memorable about themselves. And this is not only stimulating, but also challenging for learners. They actually have to speak in English. And by the end of the exercise, an added bonus, an added feature is that I usually am able to remember about 80% of the students' names. I'm very proud of myself for having done that. So what are some useful activities to engage learners? Well, there are things like stimulating pictures, games, music, discussions, dramatic stories, amusing anecdotes. So let me go on now to my next point, which has to do with study activities in the language class. In study activities, students focus on language or information and how it's constructed. For higher level students, these activities can range from the analysis of vocabulary study to an analysis of how a writer achieves an effect. And there are different ways to do study activities. The teacher can explain or demonstrate a point, or students can work on some feature to discover language for themselves. And if we go on now to my next piece here, which is on activate, that part of the lesson that where students get to use language as freely and meaningfully as they can. They want to be able, this gives learners practice in creating language in a kind of, according to Harmer, a rehearsal for the real world. Remember, language is going to be used in the real world, and here are some worthwhile activate exercises, including things like sharing. I love to do sharing, and I love to do role plays, fun type thing, debates, that was more extended activity, discussions, story and poem writing, writing in groups as part of my project work, which I do a lot of in my textbook. So according to Harmer, again, these three elements need to be present in most lessons or in teaching sequences. You might not be able to do everything in the same lesson. And once students have been engaged in learning about language or acquiring information, they studied. The learners should be given the opportunity to use the language even for a short amount of time. So let me go on now to my next piece here, which is on pacing. What's pacing? It's all about the flow and momentum of a lesson. A successful lesson has to move along fluidly as much as possible. And of course, the time of the day, who is present in class? Hopefully little Jean-Luc is not there, who is a troublemaker, but anyway. And the level of student engagement also play a role in pacing. So again, Richards, I refer back to him. He recommends a number of points to keep in mind when planning a lesson and pacing it. So don't spend an inordinate amount of time on long-winded explanations or instructions. So in the first 75 minutes of a 3-hour class, I work in a smart classroom at the college using a screen and an overhead projector, and I selectively present some of the key information from the day's readings, and I'll often elicit information from students about key vocabulary or language features. I'll also mix up activities. In other words, don't carry on an activity for too long, even though it may be entertaining. And I often mix the way students work together, individual work, pair work, or small group work. Don't be overly repetitive. However, I've learned over the years that learners do appreciate familiar patterns in lessons, providing a sense of security. So for in each lesson, I have learners do some teaching themselves or making a presentation in what I call a short talk. The short talk is a clearly defined short speaking activity schedule. I do that right at the beginning of a term. And it gears the activities to students. You want to gear the activities. The next point is to gear the activities to students' level of abilities. By finding the right level can be challenging, but it's important to do that. And then you want to have a clear goal, a specific timeline in mind for each activity. So important. In fact, I will often write a specific target time on the whiteboard for each segment of the lesson, as well as even for each activity. And then finally, you want to pay attention, track students, how they're performing by circulating around class, asking questions, and giving feedback. And this is hard work. You know, if you're an experienced teacher or a novice, this is hard work, but students usually appreciate the attention you give them. So let's move on now to one of my closing pieces here, which is how to close a lesson, in fact. So closing a lesson is just as important as opening it. It wraps up the lesson and sets the stage for the following lesson. And ideally, you want to summarize the key points of the lesson. I often ask students, what is the key learning point that they take away from the lesson? And I'll elicit that, go around the class and have students make a comment and even write it on the chalkboard. And so here are 3 ways I like to close a lesson. So first, I have students, I praise students for their good work or participation in the lesson. Students always appreciate the recognition that you give them. Also, for each lesson, I try to give some form of evaluation in the form, let's say, of a 15 to 20 minute closed-ended quiz on the contents of the lesson, on the reading that was done for homework, that I include on the web companion. So this would be a self-accessed, will be an accessed in the lab, and it would be automatically corrected in the web companion. Great time saver. Very important, my last point is to post homework for the next lesson in the college's email system, which students can access on their mobile, thankfully, and they go on and look at that. And this is a must to keep students on task, on track. They really appreciate having this kind of reminder. So there you have it. You can reach me if you're interested in learning more about what I'm doing. Frank at frankbunkowski.com, my email. You can get a free copy of Actively Engage in Academic Writing at Bokomaru Publications. And I want to wish you a great day, and thanks for watching. Bye now.